introduce the speakers and the moderator for today's webinar. The first speaker is Madhur Srinivas, who is a senior policy research associate at Dwara Research. Madhu is an experienced public policy professional with close to a decade of experience in the financial sector. His main areas of expertise are banking regulation, consumer protection, and financial inclusion. The second speaker is Soumini Prasad, who is a research associate at Dwara Research. Soumini's focus areas include design of insurance distribution systems, regulation and supervision of banking system participants, consumer protection, and commercial health insurance. Apart from the current research, which she will be presenting, she is also working on studying the low levels of penetration of life insurance in India through a supply side lens. The moderator for the event is Sampath Kumar, who is an expert on financial sector research. Sampath has worked in varied fields, including accounting, business consulting, and financial services over the past 32 years. He has researched the financial services industry for more than 2 decades, initially as credit analyst with ICRA, later as equity analyst with various firms, including Goldman Sachs, IIFL Institutional Equities, and ABM AMRO Asia Equities. So thanks a lot, Madhu, Soumini, and Sampath for taking out time. Really delighted to have you guys over for this. So let's get on with the show now. Over to you, Madhu and Soumini, for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Ravi. I'll just take a moment to share my screen. So is everybody able to view my screen?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay. So before I get started with the webinar, I'll just like to take a few minutes to briefly introduce my organization, Dwara Research. We are a financial sector and financial inclusion policy research and advocacy institution based in India. Our primary stakeholders are low-income households and small businesses, and our goal is to enable the financial system to work for them. To that end, we are interested in the themes of customer protection, regulation and supervision, systemic stability, managing financial distress, and among other themes. Our interest in transparency stems from the interlinkages between transparency, market discipline, and systemic stability. So just to give you a context about why we are doing this work. To give you the brief outline of today's webinar, I'll be taking you through the background and rationale for our research study, and also elaborating on the analytical methodology that we used for our research paper. Then Soumini will be taking over and presenting to you the findings and our recommendations on the study. Yeah. So very broadly, market disciplining work towards identifying is a mechanism in which market participants identify, monitor, and discipline the risk-taking activities of financial institutions. In fact, the Basel III framework recognizes market discipline as one of the pillars, along with regulation and supervision that helps maintain systemic stability. In the context of this study, we are focusing the market disciplining aspect to only the credit institutions in India's banking system, namely scheduled commercial banks, urban cooperative banks, regional rural banks, and non-bank financial companies. And non-bank financial companies. And broadly, we view the mechanism through which this market discipline operates as having 3 channels. The private investor channel, the public investor channel, and the depositor channel. Over here, we realize that these channels are not mutually exclusive, and you have a certain level of commingling among them. And also, they differentially apply to various entities. So, for instance, scheduled commercial banks, having been listed, can be subject to market discipline by private investors, public investors, and also depositors. In contrast, entities like RRBs or not RRBs, they don't have they are not listed, so they are not sort of disciplined by private or public investors, but only by depositors. And we believe the integral to the effective functioning of the depositor and public investor channels is the availability of transparent public disclosures, which is also the focus of our paper. If you look at transparency, we can define it as the public disclosure of reliable and timely information that enables the users of that information to make an accurate assessment of a bank's financial condition. And this is a definition that we borrow from the Basel Committee report on enhancing transparency in the banking system. Over here, we recognize that transparent disclosures are a necessary but not sufficient input in achieving market discipline. The idea here is that along with transparent disclosures, we also have cognitive biases and behavioral biases, which play an important role in the functioning of the market discipline mechanism. So transparent disclosures are necessary, but they don't by themselves ensure the functioning of market discipline. Looking at the relationship between transparency and financial stability, we can identify two beneficial outcomes that can result if we assume that transparent disclosures enable effective market discipline. One is in detection and prevention of problems from occurring. Basically, your market participants would have more accurate information on banks, and then would be able to incentivize banks to behave prudently and efficiently. Another beneficial outcome is that in terms of stress and crisis, banks and other financial institutions which have more transparent disclosures will be able to better distinguish themselves from those that are vulnerable, and then market participants themselves would be able to better distinguish healthy banks from the less healthy ones, and then thereby reduce contagion risk. Next, we look at the literature review in this topic. So there are both theoretical and empirical evidence which support the operation of market discipline and the beneficial outcomes of this in various markets. So theoretically, we find that there are models, economic models, which see that firms with higher levels of disclosure experience lower cost of capital due to reduced information asymmetry, and also that, and not only at entity level but at system-wide level, a lack of disclosures or lack of transparency, or in this case opacity in markets, could lead to financial fragility due to mispricing of risks. At an empirical level, we find that there are considerable evidence in other jurisdictions where investors discipline banks which take excessive risks, and also they also incentivize banks with lower cost of capital which take lower risk. If you analyze the evidence from India, the studies on the transparency of disclosures in India are quite sparse and also not comprehensive enough. Most importantly, these studies are exposed analysis of disclosures published in the financial reports against regulatory requirements or transparency index as constructed by the authors for an observed set of sample banks. Now, this is also an important sort of evidence which looks at exposed disclosures by banks. But then there is a lack of studies which look at transparency in the disclosure requirements ex ante itself, that is as prescribed by the regulations. So our rationale over here is that if the regulations themselves do not prescribe or inadequately prescribe non-transparent sort of disclosures, any amount of compliance would still not enable the transparency to affect the market participants. Which brings us to the research objective of our paper. to put it in a nutshell, our research objective is to assess the regulatory regime applicable to public disclosures of India's banking system participants and comment on their transparency level. Over here, I would like to emphasize that we are looking only at the regulations and what the regulations mandate, and we do not make any comment or survey on the complaints or otherwise of these regulations. So we haven't looked at what every entity actually discloses and how these disclosures are near or faithful to the letter and spirit of the regulation. So we don't make a comment over that. Moving over to the section on analytical methodology. So the scope of the study, like I mentioned earlier, so we assess the public disclosures of scheduled commercial banks, urban cooperative banks, regional rural banks, and non-bank financial companies. So they constitute about 97% of the bank sector's total assets. And if you look at the ecosystem of regulators and regulations affecting their public disclosures, so we see that, for example, scheduled commercial banks, they have, in addition to RBI disclosures and the accounting disclosures according to Indian GAAP standards, they also have, since they are listed, they'll have disclosure according to SEBI and also Basel III disclosures. Whereas if you see UCBs and RRBs, they only have RBI disclosures and your basic accounting disclosures. With regard to NBFCs, it's a bit different because you will have certain NBFCs who come under Indian GAAP and certain others who will come under Ind AS. But otherwise, the other sort of applicable disclosures remain the same. So again, over here, a bank or an NBFC, they disclose a variety of information, but to bring greater alignment between the objectives of this study and VARA research primary focus on financial stability, we are focusing only on regulations which prescribe the following three categories of information. Risk management strategies and practices, risk exposures, and financial position. Okay, so what is it? How is it that we are going to assess the transparency of these disclosures or the disclosure mandated by regulations? So we use a framework developed by the Basel Committee report on enhancing bank transparency, which classifies 5 qualitative dimensions of information that contribute to that transparency. So these qualitative dimensions are comprehensiveness, relevance and timeliness, reliability, comparability, and materiality. To briefly walk you through each dimension, with regard to comprehensiveness, the goal is to find out whether if these disclosures or the information that is being disclosed is aggregated and consolidated across all entities and activities. That is to find out whether if they comprehensively cover all economic activities represented by that entity, which it's supposed to represent. On relevance and timeliness, the idea is to assess whether the disclosed information are relevant and timely to the decision-making needs of the consumer. On reliability, we need to check whether the disclosed information faithfully represents the underlying economic information that it purports to represent. So, for instance, historical and audited information would be very reliable because it's historical and it's audited, so there's been a third party which has looked at this information. But then if you look at estimates, like for example, your expected loss models, now these are based on assumptions and they would be ranking less on reliability. However, in contrast, these ECL models or any other market risk models would be probably more relevant for a risk analyst or equity analyst, but then they would score lower on reliability. So I'm just trying to bring out the nuance over here. Then we move on to comparability, which tries to assess whether the definitions and the measurement concepts and the definition of the metrics used to construct all this data, are they comparable to the entity's peer and also to its own history. So the idea is that if I'm able to compare the information that is being put out by one bank with another bank, and there is a level of standardization among the information that is being put out. Finally, we come to materiality, where we assess whether if the omission of any information would significantly alter the decision-making process of the consumer. In using this framework, we recognize that there's a considerable level of subjectivity in both the interpretation and applicability of each of these dimensions to the information that is being disclosed. Also, one of the reasons that we're using a framework like this is to have a non-arbitrary touchstone to which we assess the transparency instead of having ad hoc calls to just more disclosure. So our objective is not to just say you need to disclose more information on whatever aspects, but to have a framework being developed by one of the foremost authorities on banking regulation and try to compare the existing disclosures and with the framework. So to that extent, we are trying to make this as objective as possible. Now, let me illustrate on a bit on how we apply the framework. So to give you an example, we take the dimension of comprehensiveness. So the idea is that we need to assess whether the information that's being disclosed is aggregated and consolidated across a number of entities and the activities so that the market participants and the consumers of the information get a complete picture of the risk involved. And over here, we, again, like I mentioned earlier, there's some overlap between the dimensions themselves. So there could be some overlap between this dimension and the materiality dimension. So how we test for comprehensiveness is that we check whether if the particular regulation applies to all verticals, associate companies, subsidiaries, sectors, geographies of the entities being referred. If it does apply, we check whether the language in the circular conveys this. And finally, whether the metrics and measures mandated to be disclosed exhaustively cover the object that is being disclosed. Now, I hand it over to Tomini to present the findings.
Thank you, Madhu. Hope I'm audible. So as Madhu discussed earlier, there are differences in terms of the disclosure standards which are applicable to each of these entities, which were part of the study. So accordingly, we find that these differences translated into different levels of transparency. So what I'll do now is discuss some of the key findings on how each of these entities fared against the 5 dimensions of transparency. Now, since it's an extensive study and the findings go into significant detail in the paper itself, I'll cover 1 dimension or maximum 2 for each entity, and also ensure that I cover each dimension so that there is more clarity on how we have gone about applying the framework. This is also in the interest of time. Now, starting with scheduled commercial banks, our analysis of the disclosure standards applicable to them revealed to us that SEBs fare well on the dimensions of comprehensiveness, reliability, and comparability. When it comes to timeliness, however, we find that RBI disclosures are mostly annual in nature. So this cuts across actually most of all the entities that we have covered and most of the disclosures. For example, if you're talking about RBI disclosures on capital adequacy, which requires disclosing information on the various components of capital, which could be tier 1, tier 2 capital and risk weighted assets. These are annual in nature. However, we know that risks on the balance sheets of banks or even NBFCs for that matter can materialize at a much more frequent sort of a duration. For example, in case of credit risk, in the case of banks, it could materialize over a period of 90 days, which is over a period of quarter. So there is clearly a mismatch in terms of the frequency of RBI disclosures which are mandated and the actual materialization of risk. So with SEBs, at least we find that Basel Pillar 3 disclosures mitigate this inadequacy to an extent because they require SEBs to disclose certain information on a quarterly basis. Now, when it comes to other dimensions, which is relevance and materiality, we find that the disclosure standards are lacking or inadequate in case of SEBs. For example, if we take relevance, and if we look at the second example, which is on the slide on disclosure of risk metrics, with respect to investment portfolio of banks, for example, RBI requires disclosure of information with respect to deterioration in quality of investments, which is basically NPA, and aggregate NPAs on the non-SLR portfolio. So here, our observation is that any meaningful analysis of risk exposure of a bank would require information on sources of risk, what are the components of risk, and what is the expected impact that the bank can expect on its financial health because of these risk exposures. So the current disclosures clearly do not give a complete picture of the risk profile of the bank. So here, we observe that risk metrics such as PV01 or VAR or duration might be actually helpful in understanding the risk sensitivity of the investment portfolio of SEBs. Now, moving on to NBFCs. Now, for NBFCs, what we've done is we have restricted our analysis to only those which have permission to raise liabilities from public investors or depositors. So this would be all deposit-taking NBFCs, both listed and unlisted, and listed non-deposit-taking systemically important NBFCs. So basically, as you can see in the figure on the slide, there are two sets of disclosure standards which are applicable to NBFCs. So there are one set of NBFCs for which Ind AS is applicable. So this includes listed NBFCs and unlisted deposit-taking NBFCs, which have net worth of 250 crore or above. And additionally, for listed NBFCs, SEBI disclosures also become applicable. And we have a second set of NBFCs for which only Indian GAAP is applicable on account of their net worth being less than 250 crores. Can I move to the next slide? So first, let's look at the NBFCs for which Ind AS is applicable. So we find that on the dimensions of comprehensiveness, comparability, and materiality, these NBFCs actually fare decently. But specifically on reliability, we find that unlike SEBs for which Indian GAAP is applicable, Ind AS here requires these NBFCs to disclose information on their extent and the nature of risk that they're exposed to from various financial instruments that they have on their balance sheets. So NBFCs are accordingly required to provide a qualitative information on overview for each type of risk, be it credit risk, liquidity risk, or market risk, and also include information on methods and what are the methodology that they've used to measure the risk, and also some of the assumptions that underlie the models that have been used. So such qualitative information we find have actually complemented the quantitative information on risk exposures, which are contained in both RBI disclosure requirements and Ind AS requirements. On the remaining dimensions, Madhu, can you go to the previous slide? So specifically on relevance, I just wanted to point out that the first example on information on advances across economic sectors. So here we find that one dimension that can actually reveal riskiness of the portfolio or the risk profile of banks is actually looking at what are the different economic sectors from which these risks are coming from. But we also find that RBI does not require NBFCs to actually disclose advances by economic sector, which we find that it's actually sort of inadequate in terms of how relevant the disclosures are. Next slide, please. Now, when we are talking about deposit-taking unlisted NBFCs to which Indian GAAP is applicable, we find that only on the dimension of comparability, they fare well in terms of transparency. On the rest of the dimensions, they actually fall short in terms of transparency or the extent to which they disclose information. So for example, next slide, specifically on materiality, RBI's liquidity risk management framework requires NBFCs to design and conduct stress tests on a regular basis for various short-term or protracted stress scenarios. However, there's actually no requirement for NBFCs from RBI to actually make these disclosures public. So we feel that this is something that needs to be disclosed, and we'll discuss about this in more detail in the recommendation section. Next slide. When it comes to UCBs and RRBs, we find that the disclosures fare well on the dimensions of only comprehensiveness and comparability. And for the rest of them, we find that they're inadequate. So in relation to UCBs, for example, one example could be that we found that like SEBs and NBFCs, information on concentration of credit risk by economic sectors is something which is lacking. And in case of RRBs, disclosures on NPAs do not include exposed information on divergences, which actually reduce the reliability of information which is already disclosed in the financial statements. Now, so this was a sort of a quick snapshot of the findings that we have. When it comes to recommendations, we have a total of 5 set of recommendations which reflect some of the key findings that we have discussed till now. So these relate to the themes that we found to be recurring in nature and of sort of significance to ensure transparent public disclosures. So the first one is about the inadequacy in disclosures on risk-related information. So this is again a common theme running across all the entities that we cover. So our recommendation here is to move away from just disclosing gross values of exposure and capital charges to disclosing more qualitative and quantitative information, which actually talk about what are the underlying risk drivers, what are the models used, and what are the assumptions that went into modeling some of these risks. The second recommendation is on stress test scenarios and results. So here, like I mentioned earlier, we are of the opinion that disclosing design of stress test scenarios can actually give an insight into what the management thinks, what are the underlying risk drivers for the financial entities which were under consideration. And when it comes to results itself, we feel that this kind of information can actually give a forward-looking information and also complement some of the risk metrics that we discussed earlier, which are mostly historical in nature. And the third recommendation is around alignment between RBI and Ind AS disclosures. So here, what we feel is that Ind AS actually complements RBI disclosures when it comes to quantitative information. So, but as we know, accounting standards are usually mostly sort of provide a guidance to the entities in terms of what needs to be disclosed. So the specificities in terms of how they want to disclose it is left to the judgment of the entities. So here we feel the RBI can actually, build on the guidance provided by accounting standards and then specify in detail, or at least define a minimum set of disclosures so that relevant and material information is not missed out. And also this can ensure comparability across similar NBFCs. Now, the fourth one is on the applicability of Ind AS. So after looking at, how Ind AS actually has enhanced the transparency levels in case of NBFCs, listed NBFCs and unlisted NBFCs with net worth more than 250 crores, we feel that it should be extended to SCBs, UCBs, and RRBs. One, it will help fill RBI's disclosure requirement gaps. Two, it will harmonize accounting standards applicable across all entities. And particularly, for example, on measuring credit risks, we feel that ECL is sort of more forward-looking, and it can actually help harmonize the sort of volatility that we see in credit risks. So the last one is on frequency of disclosures. Like we saw, the timeliness of disclosures is annual, mostly as prescribed by RBI. So here we feel that at least on certain aspects like credit risk, or it could be in terms of disclosures on capital or NPA status, some of these disclosures can at least be made quarterly. Yeah, so these are the set of recommendations that we have.
All right, thank you, Madhu. Thank you, Samini. Sorry.
1 second. So just some closing comments. So what I would like to specifically, thank Dr. Harshvardhan, who's the executive in residence at the Center for Financial Studies and an adjunct faculty at the SPJ Institute of Management Research, for his extensive feedback on the draft version of the paper. And I would also like to add that, this is the first big piece of research that Financial Systems Design Initiative of Dwara Research has undertaken on the theme of transparency. So just to flag that we're definitely not experts in this field. So any comments and feedback would be definitely welcome, especially from practitioners who would have a better idea of how these disclosures actually translate into some of the decisions that they make. And this is also just a first piece of work that we have planned in the entire theme on transparency. And we hope that the insights from this work will actually feed into some of the more empirical work that we have planned. So over to you, Sampath.
Right. Thank you, Madhu. Thank you, Samini. I think you covered quite a bit of ground in a short period of time. Let me kick off the debate with a few questions before we get into audience Q&A, the participants Q&A. One of the key questions I have, that's where I want to start with, is, did you find in your research any greater latitude among the intermediaries in interpreting the RBI guidance and rules when disclosing? I'm asking this question specifically because we have seen failures of banks and financial institutions in the recent past. And this appeared to have happened suddenly, despite all these disclosures. So what is your research finding on this?
So like I mentioned earlier, so we haven't directly looked on what are the actual disclosures made by banks or NBFCs. Having said that, when we spoke to market participants, they mentioned that to give a specific instance, banks have to disclose their exposures, both NPAs and total exposures by economic sectors, industry, agri, retail, personal, so on and so forth. So what they mentioned is that these definitions are not clearly defined, and depending on each bank, the definition can change. And even the banks are known to sort of change between, let's say, large MSMEs. Sometimes they'll come under retail, sometimes they'll go under industry, and depending on how to sort of, I wouldn't say massage the NPA numbers, but depending on how the NPA numbers flow. So yeah, we believe that there is considerable latitude in some of the definitions that RBI disclosures give. And like Soumni had mentioned, while Ind AS complements RBI's disclosures by providing guidance on certain risk sensitivity analysis, it does not clearly mention what are the metrics that needs to be disclosed. So that gives considerable leeway for each institution to disclose its own metric with its own assumptions.
All right. Okay. I think the second question, which I have, also will require some amount of empirical evidence. You might have some limitation here, but despite that, I would like to hear from you. Does governance and disclosure go hand in hand? And this is an evidence we have found in other places, governance and in general management and so on and so forth, financial performance in particular. But even in disclosures, have you found anything that bearing this relationship?
Not directly, but in the couple of papers, or in the few papers that we had analyzed in the Indian context, they found that there is some level of correlation between the transparency of the disclosure index that the authors created and the level of corporate governance, again, by some measure they created. But that was, again, not the main focus of the paper itself. It is more towards the level of disclosure that the any entity the sampled entities were performing.
All right. Okay. And I would assume that there is going to be a greater degree of lack of consistency across intermediaries. Because banks are a little more closely monitored, so we probably have better disclosures or better consistency, so to speak, vis-a-vis others.
Yeah.
Is this something that?
To add to Soumni's points, this is actually a part of a larger work stream, a multi-year work stream that we're looking at. So this is a first step in that, where we look at the regulations themselves. And like I mentioned, this is regulation, but what happens on the ground, right? So that we are. The next step, we are as part of the next step, we are looking at empirical formulations in which we can actually detect your relation between transparency and market discipline, and how effective or otherwise it is across, again, various channels, be it depositors, investors, your bond market, or even your overnight, your call money market, so on and so forth. So that is also one reason why we thought we should engage as much with practitioners. So we have very academic viewpoint, and practitioners would be able to help give us a better, suggestions on how to sort of proceed on this. So that's sort of the next part, empirical.
Right. Okay. Okay, that will be very interesting to see. Now, you have mentioned in your study that Ind AS implementation has complemented with RBI's requirements and disclosures as far as NBFCs are concerned. Now, I will also say that RBI also has been tightening the disclosure standards from time to time. Now, what is the kind of improvement? How is Ind AS throwing a better picture of risk profile of financial intermediaries, particularly NBFCs, across various risk categories: credit, market risk, and operational risk? And how do you see them actually, complementing what RBI already requires in some of these respects?
Someone, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. One is, just to mention, we haven't actually looked at the actual disclosures of NBFCs. So we've looked at how the regulations define some of these disclosures. I would say that at least comparing the two sets of NBFCs that we have, the one for which Indian GAAP is applicable, erstwhile Indian GAAP, and the other set of NBFCs for which Ind AS is applicable, I can definitely say that Ind AS implementation has considerably improved the transparency levels on the risk profile of NBFCs. So one example could be on the market risks, right? So for example, RBI disclosures require NBFCs to disclose just the gross amount of exposure to, for example, the real estate market and also the capital markets. So the disclosures just stop at that. One, so there are two problems here, right? It doesn't give a complete picture of risk profile of the NBFCs. First, it doesn't cover all the economic sectors. And two, what is the expected impact that the NBFC has from these risks that it is exposed to? It could be credit risk or market risk. So here, Indian GAAP is actually quite silent. And Ind AS actually specifically on market risk, it requires NBFCs to conduct sensitivity analysis and also disclose that in their annual reports. And this is across each of the risks that we spoke under market risk, for example. It could be interest rate risk, it could be any other risk. And on liquidity risk, again, it requires them to show a maturity profile of its different assets and liabilities. And another example, again, could be of credit risk, where currently we have a incurred loss provisioning method for credit risk, whereas ECL sort of moved towards more forward-looking information-based provisioning requirement. So I would definitely say that there is a considerable improvement in terms of transparency for those NBFCs.
All right. Okay. Coming to the next question, where you did talk about stress tests to an extent and the disclosure of those results. Now they have one, I don't know whether you looked at this point as well. Right now, all disclosures are based on a standardized approach as far as Basel III goes. RBI has been debating whether they should allow advanced approaches, which is essentially internal risk-based approach for measuring risk as well as conducting any kind of sensitivity. Have you looked at this aspect, how a difference between advanced and standardized approach can improve some of those disclosures that banks are currently making? Because right now, when you're doing a standardized approach, everybody is put across on the same benchmark. And so it's unlikely that it may not show, I wouldn't say it's unlikely, it may not show the significant differences in the risk profile that prevail today. So what we have today as disclosures, is it right to say that we have, using a standardized approach, a limited scale on which we are trying to measure and analyze the risk?
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. So there are two parts to this. One is your actual risk management system, whether you use a basic approach or the standard approach or the your IRB models. The other is what you disclose, right? So our focus in this paper is not so much on mandating whether you should use the standardized approach or the IRB approach. So we, in other sort of advocacy pieces, we advocate towards the IRB approach. But in the focus of this paper is more towards whatever approach do you use, do you disclose that transparently? So if you use a IRB models, are you disclosing your assumptions? Are you disclosing how the valuation methodologies and so on and so forth? So that is more the focus of this paper, to let the market, so you provide the transparent information to the market participants and let them decide whether or not you are shaking it or whether you're truly being transparent, and let them gauge the riskiness of your entity. So that is the sort of focus of this paper particularly. But on a different context, like you mentioned, yes, IRB models would involve a better would force banks especially to more closely look at their risk processes and identify and mitigate them. But then we also need to recognize that many Indian banks might not have the sort of capacity to actually implement these IRB models, because again, these have to be vetted by the regulator, and it cannot just come from your own models. However, having said that, one of our recommendations is that Ind AS needs to be extended to banks, and for actually RBI is on board with it, but for some reason it's been stalling the implementation. And the implementation of Ind AS, especially on the ECL part, which is in some sense you're predicting the 1-year default and the lifetime default, is that will improve definitely the both the risk management practices of the banks and also the disclosures, because you need to disclose stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 assets and the provisions accordingly. So yeah.
I think taking on what you're saying, actually, if you want to implement Ind-AS, you also need to move to IRB system, because in Ind-AS also you're making a lot of assumptions. You need to require a lot of models, either it is liquidity, market risk, or credit risk. So essentially, these go hand in hand to an extent, I would say. One other question, which is, you looked at, I don't know, again, this is something which I'm throwing to you. When you're looking at the risks, you have aggregated a gross credit, market, and operational risk. From what I remember, and I don't do that anymore in depth, usually credit followed by operational and then market risk used to be the order in which, the risk, if you aggregate the risk, this is the order in which they will come out to be. Credit is probably about 70 to 80%, and operations another 10, 15%, the rest is market risk. Now, if you want to, some of your recommendations, if you want to fit it in actually, where do you think it's critical to improve the quantity and quality of disclosures, and where it is okay to take some time to do that?
Yeah, so given that these are all credit institutions, your credit risk is the most important risk that you need to manage. That is the business. That is what you're taking a premium because you know that you can manage your credit risk. So to that extent, most of our recommendations, be it among banks or NBFCs, it's actually more skewed towards credit risk. Yes, we have also made certain recommendations with regard to market risk and operational risk, but at least in the Indian banking scenario, we believe that the market risk component is not that significant as compared to what would be in, say, US, which have very deep bond markets, and we have banks doing proprietary trading, Volcker rule and whatnot. So to that extent, yes, credit risk is the most important sort of risk that's facing these institutions, and most of the disclosures and the transparency level needs to be improved in that direction. Having said that, this is from an academic point of view. At a practitioner's point of view, we would also like to know your views on whether, if my assumptions are right, probably is the case that market risk is also a very important risk facing banks. So I know, for instance, that Viral Acharya a couple of years ago came out heavily in a speech on banks failing to, hedge their market risk. And this is just on their government portfolio, government bond portfolio. Right? And we know that in the last 15 years, there have been 3 episodes that because of adverse movements in the government bonds, these banks took significant hits to their profits, and they had to depend on regulatory forbearance to actually tide through those losses. So again, our assumption is that credit risk is the most important to a large extent, but then happy to hear other views on this.
No, actually, coming to the reason why market risk never turns out to be a significant factor, because banks, particularly public sector banks, end up holding to maturity. And usually, as you know, the denomination of any regulation is the weakest bank becomes the common denominator for any regulation. By virtue of it, every other Indian bank takes the same advantage as far as marking to market the investment book. And as a result, if you allow public sector banks to hold a higher proportion of their investments into health maturity category, everybody else, if there is an interest rate direction is wrong, everybody else takes the same advantage. So I guess that's where we are coming from. So end of the day, very little trading happens as far as bonds are concerned. So in a sense, basically, if you're going to hold it to maturity, particularly if it is, most of it is government bonds, I guess you're not facing too much of market risk from that perspective.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, that's something which might change over time, particularly if there are going to be some deeper reforms into the banks. I will ask one more question before we pass it on to somebody else, actually. I think, as far as banks and NBFCs is concerned, we know who clear consumers are. There are depositors, there are investors, actually. When it comes to RRB or urban cooperative banks, it's both basically depositors. And RRBs, particularly UCBs and RRBs, have a lot of pitfalls, even in the way what they disclose. And I'm not sure any of them in that market will understand anything about these public disclosures.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if anybody else looked at it at all, other than from an academic perspective point of view.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Even in the case of public sector banks or even scheduled commercial banks, I'm talking about public investor channel, but then it stands to reason that how many retail investors would actually go through annual reports, try to digest them, and then act accordingly. So which is why, like I mentioned, that this is the first step in a larger work stream where we look at the whole market disciplining aspect in the Indian banking system. And the next step is to actually find out empirical evidence. Again, it might very well be the case that in this age of Twitter and social media, people are not relying so much on balance sheets, but on tweets and statements or endorsements by investors who come on these channels and so on and so forth. So that, I mean, so these are like various channels of information, and we are trying to develop some empirical strategies on how to measure this and then see record evidence on this.
Let me try and turn it on to anybody else. Ravi, if you have any question?
Yeah, no, it's I was wondering, and Sampath, you can chip in as well to this question, because you have looked at banking and NBFC stocks for a large part of your career. And I was wondering more that if you look at the non-financial sector, there is a lot of emphasis now coming in from both SEBI as well as from MCA towards sustainability reporting, right? And a lot of Indian companies now have moved towards giving a wider picture, of how their operations affect sustainability impact, right? As it's more colloquially called ESG, right? I wanted to get a sense from you, how well, is the banking sector, placed in terms of these kind of disclosures.
So currently, from what I gather, I think I read a report recently that HDFC Bank plans to go completely green by 2030. Other than that, I haven't. And again, there was this huge public backlash, both India and in Australia, against SBA for lending to Adani on that Australian Australian mines, right? So yes, there is awareness and there is some sort of pushback. But then that needs to be channelized and make more formalized. One sort of step in that direction is that the SEBI Committee on Social Stock Exchange that was set up. And then again, the technical committee has recently come out with its guidelines. We were actually, again, disclaimer, we were part of the technical secretary, we were part of the technical secretariat of the Social Stock Exchange. So we had given some inputs on that. So yes, probably once if this takes, gets on, then probably banks are, unlike your factories and other real sector players, they are not directly involved in impacting the environment. Of course, social and governance norms will still be applicable, but the environment impact is not direct. But again, like I mentioned, HDFC Bank has taken cognizance and lending more towards green energy projects and reducing the sector exposure to oil and other dirty sort of energy. So that is a good step, and hopefully there should be a more sustained movement towards in that direction. But again, unlike in other jurisdictions where you have specific ESG indices and ESG reporting, we are going in the direction. We are not in that.
Actually, in my opinion, Indian banks may be forced to follow suit. But I know for a fact that European banks focus a lot on the ESG factor. So any lending that comes to a European bank undergoes a greater amount of scrutiny on the ESG factor. If it doesn't stack up, then you don't get loan, actually. And if that happens automatically, you're going to see Indian banks also requiring to follow suit. Certainly, wherever they lend in international markets. But let's say that, if a funding requirement is so large and a part of it has to be met through international sources and that's not forthcoming, then the whole project becomes unviable.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, ESG is going to be a significant factor. It's going to come in more and more focus. Whether Indian banks like it or not, it's going to be forced upon them, I would think.
Yeah, and I think that'll be really nice, because the extent of capital which the financial sector as well as banks provide, like they have actually a lot of stake in terms of doing proper sustainability reporting in terms of how they are their credit policies and how their off-take policies are linked towards ESG sectors. But another question for you, Sampath, would you say, and in what factors, if yes, are there differences between reporting of various disclosures and if you were to group public sector banks and private sector banks, what do you think are pluses and minuses that both these groups do well or not too good?
As I said, basically, because there is a common minimum requirement. So in that respect, both are required to disclose certain things. But I would say, I mean, my experience at least has been in the past that it's very difficult to read. Now, to give an example, if you look at HDFC Bank's disclosure of risk, credit risk across less than 100%, 100%, greater than 100%, you'll find that HDFC Bank had, at least in the past, a higher share of greater than 100% risk, the exposure in their overall credit exposures, and compare it with some other even smaller private sector banks. Even for that matter, even if you look at S Bank at that time, you will wonder how is that HDFC Bank is carrying more exposure to greater than 100% category compared to many other banks, actually. So that's where it's hard to establish this fact unless you sit with each bank and understand what they do and how they do, and not all will be forthcoming. That's the biggest issue. I had that opportunity to discuss with HDFC Bank, so I understood what was the factor behind that, but I don't have the same explanation with everybody else. So yes, there is an issue of comparability when it comes to disclosure. There is some degree of us. For instance, some people used to for a long period of time. If you look at between public sector and private sector banks, somebody like most private sector banks used to include exposure to what is held to maturity. They will include it in the gross credit exposure. Public sector banks never did it, actually. So I don't understand why there is a difference in these two in the first place. Now, if you're just looking at the gross credit exposure and looking at it and looking at the number, you wonder basically why is this number so big compared to the balance sheet size of the bank, in the case of private sector. So there are some differences in the way they report, actually. And that's why I think to a large extent, I tend to rely more on governance factor to judge the quality of disclosures from each of these factors than anybody else. So if you come to the governance factor, you would always believe that even among public sector banks, SBI quality of disclosures tend to be better than many other banks, actually. And I guess there is going to be also difference across the sizes. I haven't looked at it in greater detail there, actually, but I would tend to think that there is going to be some differences based on the size of the bank as well.
Okay, so I had one more question, and of course, this is open to Madhu, Soumini, and Sampath. Would love to have your guys' view on this. So we always think about disclosures by banks in terms of what is the systemic risk that they present, as well as how good are they for the investor community evaluate their performance. I think one aspect that we overlook is disclosure standards by banks are also actually so relevant for the government policy making, because both fiscal and monetary policy, for you to do well in that domain, you actually need the banking services industry in the country to be top notch in terms of reporting. And to give a context to this question, right? So post the global financial crisis, right, we had a move by the government to, push demand. And one part of that pushing of demand was to, encourage banks to lend more, right? Now, a way for you to evaluate how well that worked out or not, or dynamically change that policy would be to see what effect it is having on maybe NPAs or growth credit offtake, and look at how, we did, because post, doing that policy for many years, we had this huge NPA crisis, and lingering effects of that NPA crisis still affects policy today. So love to have, your views on this.
Sampath, you want to go first?
All right. It is always a bit of a gray subject, I would say. Trying to. It's right that I think if the disclosures were right, then I think we would have solved this NPL issue much ahead. And it's clear that whatever they push the government gave in order to revive the economy has had its cost very clearly. And that was largely led by public sector banks than private sector banks at that stage. I think the issue would also be that, from a regulation point of view, even if we had all of these issues, if regulation were to be stricter in its recognition, we wouldn't face much of this problem, at least a lingering problem, I would say. The problem is basically, we moved from one to another, allowing banks some latitude in not recognizing that for a long period of time. And that changed somewhere in about 17, 18 to a large extent. It became much stricter. But again, we have this pandemic now, and once again, we have all this relaxations given to banks in the recognition. So we're going to have this problem. I think what the West did was better in terms of model, that you give whatever relaxations that is the need of the hour. You need to give that. I don't think we can escape any kind of escape not giving any kind of allowance to the borrowers given the situation. But what it should have also dictated to the banks is to make high upfront provisions, which is what the West did mostly. So which allowed you to build a buffer cushion. And then you went to, and the other advantage, of course, the West had was, when particularly US banks, when they went into this crisis, they had a much stronger balance sheet. Unfortunately, Indian banks were still repairing the balance sheet and actually shoring it up. Private sector banks definitely have much better balance sheet, without a doubt. Public sector banks still somewhat weaker actually on the quality of capital. Yes, so I think somewhere, if regulation is stricter, I think we will circumvent or overcome all of these problems to a large extent. There is always going to be a cost of excesses at any given point of time, whether it is government directed or not. But I think the recognition is the most important thing here. And if that happens in a timely fashion, I don't think we will have these issues.
Yeah, so completely agree with Sampath. So just to add, along with regulation, supervision is the main aspect. Like, it's not the case that the RBI does not know what's going in the bank's book. It does, but then it chooses to do that the way, or in some sense, does this forbearance, which basically is kicking the can down the road. Eventually, you're going to face the losses. And the first AQR in 2015 showed what the extent of the rot was. So that sort of discipline and that attitude and the culture that needs to be maintained going forward. If we are to, again, okay, pandemic is a very catastrophic event. Yes, there could be some level of forbearance and relaxation, but like Sampath said, you should be able to absorb that losses upfront by building your capital buffer. So are you doing that? What is the quality of your capital? Again, if your NPAs are hidden, your quality, your 15% or your 17% CRA is not actually 17%. It's probably much lesser. So these are things that need to sort of be tightened to much stricter supervision. Yeah.
Great. No, thanks. Thanks a lot, Madhu, Soumini, and Sampath, for taking out time. We are we are at 6:30 now. We have to close the webinar. Really appreciate all of you guys taking out time for this. A reminder to the audience: you can assess and download Madhu and Soumini's paper on this topic, which goes into a lot of detail. It's a public document. You can access it for your benefit. And thank you so much again, and thanks to the audience for participating in today's webinar. We hope you found it useful, and please log into the CFA Society website for details on future events, as well as you can access the recording of the prior events as well. Thank you so much. Keep safe until next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.